Fellow here. It's my pleasure to introduce Amy Zegart, who thankfully almost didn't make it here because of some transportation problems, but luckily she arrived just in the nick of time. She's an associate professor at UCLA's School of Public Affairs. National Journal feature as one of the 10 most influential experts in the country on intelligence reform. She worked on the NSC staff in the Clinton administration. She served as a foreign policy advisor to the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2000. She received her PhD in political science from Stanford University, where her thesis advisor was Condoleezza Rice. And she's written this excellent new book, Spying Blind, which she's going to talk about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. When Peter says I just got here, I really did just get here. Amtrak isn't running in either direction from Philadelphia. So I would have dressed for the occasion had I had the time. And I have to say there's only one other time where it was a more harrowing travel experience, and it was when I interviewed Mac Bundy for my last book. And it was a day in New York, and I was in a very, very slow cab, very typical for New York, and I ran 12 blocks in high heels in the middle of July. And when I arrived at his office, I was literally drenched in sweat. And he came out and he said, classic Mac Bundy, "I heard you had a cab adventure this morning, but judging by the look of you, I'd say you swam here." And that was the beginning of my interview with Mac Bundy. So I'm very delighted that I've made it here today. And what I want to do is share with you all the book that I've just finished that I spent the past 5 years researching. And I'd like to start by sharing with you all a moment in time that first captured my attention when I learned about it during the joint inquiry in the fall of 2002. So transport yourselves back, if you can, to before 9/11, to the first week of January in the year 2000. There is a meeting of suspected high-level al-Qaeda operatives gathering in Kuala Lumpur, what one intelligence official later described to me as the al-Qaeda convention. Among the participants is this man, Khalid al-Mihdhar. Many of you may recognize the name. He's one of the 9/11 hijackers who flew American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. The CIA is watching at this meeting, gets a photograph of al-Mihdhar and some of the others, gets a copy of his passport, gets his full name, and uncovers one other crucial piece of information. The CIA learns that Khalid al-Mihdhar holds a multiple entry visa to the United States. It is 20 months before 9/11. CIA Director George Tenet later admitted that the agency should have notified the FBI about Khalid al-Mihdhar and should have notified the State Department, putting al-Mihdhar on the now infamous watch list, which could have possibly denied him entry. But the CIA doesn't do this until August 23rd, 2001, 19 days before 9/11 and months after Khalid al-Mihdhar and another of the hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi, settled in Southern California, not too far away from where I live, used their real names, we know, on everything from rental agreements to telephone listings, lived with an FBI informant, made contact with several targets of past and ongoing FBI counterterrorism investigations, and started taking flying lessons. The natural question that I thought of when I heard about this incident was, why did it take so long to watch list Khalid al-Mihdhar? Why in particular did it take so long to watch list this al-Qaeda operative when the CIA was, in George Tenet's own words, at war with Osama bin Laden? When Tenet had issued clear public warnings for 3 consecutive years to Congress that al-Qaeda posed one of the gravest dangers to American national security? Why did it take so long in the spring and summer of 2001 when we know that intelligence chatter about a spectacular terrorist attack was spiking? Well, I concluded the simplest answer is that the CIA had never been in the habit of watch listing suspected al-Qaeda operatives before. For 40 years, the agency and the dozen or so other agencies that constitute our intelligence community had operated with Cold War procedures, Cold War priorities, Cold War thinking, none of which gave high priority to identifying foreign terrorists and warning other government agencies about them. As one CIA employee later told congressional investigators, he believed it was, in his words, not incumbent, even on the CIA's special Osama bin Laden unit, to watch list people like al-Mihdhar. More recently, the CIA's own internal 9/11 review, a few pages of which were recently declassified, found, there it is, that there is no coherent functioning watch listing program. And one of the most interesting things about these few declassified pages is that they conclude that between 50 and 60 officials in the CIA, all different levels, different offices, all had access to cables with travel information about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and didn't notify another agency about these two men, an organizational-wide failure. For me, this watch listing example, which is one of 23 specific opportunities to disrupt the 9/11 plot that I look at, provides a chilling example, I think, of the powerful effects of organization. And by organization, I mean three things in particular: structures, cultures, and incentives. The structures and the cultures and the incentives of our national security agencies that critically influence what those agencies do and how well they do it. I argue the single most important reason we failed to prevent 9/11 wasn't the Bush administration's failure to put terrorism higher on the priority list, wasn't the Clinton administration's failure to capture or kill Osama bin Laden or respond more muscularly to earlier attacks. The single greatest reason we failed to prevent 9/11 was the stunning inability of our intelligence agencies to adapt to the end of the Cold War. Let me give you a couple of examples. During the 1990s, intelligence officials we know repeatedly warned of a grave and growing terrorist threat. And yet, based on what you can discern from classified intelligence budgets, old Cold War funding patterns continued, with more than 90% of the $30 billion plus intelligence budget being spent on hardware, things that, like satellites, very good at detecting Soviet warheads from space, rather than human intelligence, better able to penetrate terrorist groups on the ground. Although the FBI formally declared terrorism its number one priority in 1998, 3 years before 9/11, relatively early. On the morning of 9/11, only 6% of FBI personnel were working counterterrorism issues. Here's my favorite thing that I found. New agents at the FBI still received more time for vacation than they did for counterterrorism training before 9/11. And in early 2002, 2/3 of the FBI's analytic workforce was determined by an internal review unqualified to do their jobs. These are the people that are supposed to be connecting the dots. Steeped in a 70-year-old culture that prized searching houses more than searching databases, the FBI, we know, lacked even the basic computer capabilities to search for the words flight training school together. The one former FBI official said this, and it's now the title of my FBI chapter. In the words of this official, the attitude was, real men don't type at the FBI. The only thing a real agent needs is a pen, a gun, and a notebook. So in short, what I find is that the CIA and the FBI were stuck. They were unable to escape from old patterns, old ideas, old cultures, old ways, old procedures, and at the same time they failed to develop the new capabilities to give them a fighting chance against a new danger. The $64,000 question is why, and that's what my book tries to answer. Let me anchor our discussion by suggesting three possible explanations. I'm going to convince you the first two are wrong and mine is right. But I want to actually take a minute to consider and rebut the most compelling alternatives to my own argument. And as this slide, this is my opportunity to get in my favorite slide about the importance of alternative hypotheses. The glass is half full, the glass is half empty, and then there's the engineer who says, of course, the glass is twice as large as it needs to be. In order to make a really compelling case for my own argument, I want to show you why the most plausible alternatives ultimately are empirically or logically unsatisfying. So let me give you the two other arguments. The first explanation is that there really was no adaptation failure. The dangers of the post-Cold War world were too fluid, too numerous, too opaque for intelligence agencies to have picked out al-Qaeda years before 9/11. This is the hindsight bias argument. Easy for us to see al-Qaeda now as a threat, much harder in the glare of the end of the Cold War. As Sandy Berger put it, history is written through a rear-view mirror, but it unfolds through a foggy windshield. This is an empirical question. It's a question of the historical record. And I spent a great deal of time actually looking at the historical record, and I think there's a great deal of evidence that discounts this view. Let me share with you just a few nuggets. I took a look at CIA threat assessments, which were public beginning in 1994, to see, well, how did intelligence officials actually perceive the threat environment after the Cold War ended? Was it really so fluid or difficult to understand? And the answer was they were right on target. That an analysis of the threat assessments from that period finds that the intelligence community's priorities were in fact highly stable. And terrorism made the threat list every year from 1994, 1 year after the first World Trade Center attack, all the way to 2001. And starting in 1998, it was listed in the top 3 threats facing U.S. national security. Public statements and actions by elected political officials also reveal a crescendo of warnings about the terrorist threat years before 9/11. Beginning in 1994, terrorism made it into every single one of the president's State of the Union addresses, the most important policy speech given to the American public. In 1999, this is another one of my favorites that I found, Secretary of Defense William Cohen, then the sitting Secretary of Defense, wrote an op-ed to an obscure little paper called the Washington Post, in which he explicitly predicted a terrorist attack on American soil. I don't need to tell a crowd inside the Beltway that sitting Secretaries of Defense don't casually wake up one morning and say, I think I'll write an op-ed to the Washington Post about something. It's a pretty serious indication that there was serious policy awareness of the terrorist threat. Now, it could be policymakers understood the threat but didn't see the connection between the new threat and the need for organizational reform in the CIA and the FBI. But what I found is, in fact, the imperative for adaptation was also well known in Washington throughout the 1990s. Let me give you my, this is my universe of studies. What this list is the 12 major unclassified studies from 1991 to 2001 that examined either the CIA, the FBI, intelligence overall, or counterterrorism capabilities. So what I set out to do was look at what were people talking about with respect to intelligence and counterterrorism capabilities before 9/11. What did they recommend and what happened to those recommendations? And as you can see from this list, these are not obscure reports. These are the greatest hits of blue ribbon commissions, Hart-Rudman Commission, the Deutsch Commission, the Bremer Commission. They are government initiatives. Again, not small government initiatives, major government initiatives. The Reinventing Government, or the National Performance Review Initiative by President Clinton. And also nonpartisan think tank reports. Again, Council on Foreign Relations, the 20th Century Fund. And the important thing here is the bottom. These 12 studies issued a grand total of 514 recommendations overall. 2/3 of them, or 340, were targeted specifically to reform of U.S. intelligence agencies. Okay. So what happened to these recommendations? This is what I affectionately refer to as my Hollywood true story, intelligence reforms from the 90s, where are they now? Here's the picture, and it's not a very pretty picture. What you see, this big black area of the pie chart, that 79% of all recommendations, or 268 recommendations overall, produced nothing at all. No meeting, no memo, no phone call, no action of any kind. Now, this blue slice of the pie are the 35 intelligence reform recommendations that were fully implemented. There are another 30 or so that were partially implemented, and some whose implementation I couldn't determine. Let me say just a bit about my methodology. To figure this out, I interviewed at least one person who authored the report with the recommendations, and at least one person targeted with implementing those recommendations in the targeted agency. So this understates adaptation failure, right? Because people who are charged with implementing recommendations like to say they implemented them. And people who recommend recommendations like to say they were implemented as well. Two other reasons why this is a conservative estimate of adaptation failure. If sources disagreed about the extent of implementation, I erred on full implementation of the recommendation. Perhaps more troubling is if you actually take a look at what's in that blue slice of the pie, what are those reforms that were successfully implemented? They're among the least important ones. Most of them are study the problem more recommendations, as opposed to actually doing something recommendations. I'll give you an example. One successfully implemented FBI recommendation urged, and I quote, efforts should be made to explore the feasibility of instituting a capability to exchange unclassified investigative material among law enforcement and the intelligence community. This isn't even developing the capability. This is exploring the idea of developing the capability to share unclassified, not classified information. This is not a get tough standard for information sharing. More interesting is if you take a look at what these recommendations suggested, they showed a remarkable degree of consensus. The important thing here is this gray line, which is 84% of all the recommendations focused on just 4 major problems. Now, bear in mind, these studies focused on very different things. Some were focused explicitly on counterterrorism. Some were focused principally on the FBI. Some were focused on homeland security. Others on weapons of mass destruction. And yet they all found the same 4 major problems afflicting U.S. intelligence agencies. And they're probably going to sound very familiar. Problem number one was personnel problems that created skill gaps and stovepipes that hindered information sharing. Almost a third of all the recommendations focused on information sharing. Second problem was corporateness, or the inability of all of our different intelligence agencies to act as a coherent whole, something we still grapple with today. Third, problems in setting strategic missions and priorities. And finally, weak human intelligence. The reason these four categories sound so familiar is that they are exactly the same four major categories identified by the two most important 9/11 postmortems, the 9/11 Commission and the House and Senate Intelligence Committee's joint inquiry into 9/11. The same major categories of problems that these two bodies determined were crucial failings that left us vulnerable to terrorist attack. So there wasn't one canary in the coal mine in the 1990s. There were a dozen canaries in the coal mine in the 1990s. I think there's a substantial amount of evidence showing policymakers and intelligence officials understood the threat, understood the imperative for reform, and failed to get from here to there before 9/11. So that's the first argument. There was no adaptation failure. Okay. The second argument, that I don't subscribe to, admits agency failure but lays the blame on individuals. It's the finger-pointing explanation that we read so much about, particularly here in Washington. We are a nation obsessed with the personal drama of failure, with, as George Tenet's book wrote, who sits at the center of the storm. Everybody has someone to blame for 9/11. This finger-pointing approach is both understandable and, I argue in the book, dangerous. It's understandable because casting blame after moments of great tragedy makes us all feel better, and it makes for good politics and really good journalism. But it's dangerous because it suggests the wrong causes of failure and the wrong remedies to address them. We're left to think that if only a few more people had connected a few more obvious dots, if only more people in the corridors of power had had their hair on fire, to use Richard Clarke's term, then tragedy could have been averted. Bob Woodward wrote in his book, The Commanders, decision-making at the highest levels is a complex human interaction. This human story is the core. Well, what I argue is this human story is largely irrelevant to understanding the problems in our intelligence agencies. Those who want to understand what's wrong and how to fix it need to understand something far less intriguing than personal politics and blame, bureaucracy, and the organizational problems that make it likely talented officials will make bad decisions. So let me share with you my explanation for adaptation failure, which draws broadly from two literatures. One, organization theory, which is multidisciplinary. It's sociology, economics, political science, some history, focused on understanding what organizations do and why they do it, broadly conceived. The second body of literature is political science, rational choice approaches. And drawing on both of these, I argue that there are three systemic barriers or three enduring realities that make adaptation exceptionally difficult for intelligence agencies. The first, the one at the bottom, is the nature of bureaucratic organizations. No organization we know changes easily on its own. This idea is far more important than it sounds. We often lament the fact that government is not run more like a business, but it turns out businesses have a really hard time adapting to changing environmental demands as well. Private firms, we know, are the best case scenario. They're blessed with things like clear metrics, clear missions, the relative ease of hiring and firing personnel. And yet private sector firms fail at rates that may be surprising to people who don't think about them very often. Just to give you one piece of evidence, the U.S. Census Bureau tracks what happens to small businesses and found that in 1990, within 4 years, nearly a third of all small businesses had gone under. That's an astounding rate of churn in the private sector. About one business in the United States fails every minute. Now, we know this is the best case scenario. Government agencies have an even harder time adapting to new challenges because they're not designed to adapt to new challenges. They're not designed to be nimble. They're not designed to be innovative. Government agencies are designed to be reliable and fair. And there are enormous benefits to reliability and fairness. Standard operating procedures ensure that Social Security checks are mailed to all who qualify for them. They make sure that all of our pilots have the same rules of engagement in wartime. And they make sure that the lines at the DMV may be long, but all of us have to stand in them, regardless of whether we're a Democrat or Republican, how rich or well-connected we are. Reliability and fairness have their advantages. But the downside, of course, is that all the things that provide reliability and fairness, standard operating procedures, structures, routines, cultures, make it very difficult for agencies to adapt to new challenges. They are hardwired to keep doing things the same old ways, even when they shouldn't. My favorite example of this is the Army, which had a horse cavalry until World War II. So internal reform is exceptionally difficult. And I find in both the case of the CIA and the FBI that senior officials try desperately to reform everything from strategic analysis to the FBI's computer information systems and failed because they met up with these internal forces of resistance. The second systemic barrier, or enduring reality, has to do with rational self-interest of political players. Now, by rational self-interest, I'm using a very political sciencey term. And I don't mean to suggest evil motives or selfish intentions. I mean simply that there are certain incentives that come with offices that policymakers hold. Now, presidents, we know, have very good reason to overhaul intelligence, but they rarely take on the fight. And this is because, as Dick Neustadt famously wrote 30 years ago, presidents are weak. They have few formal powers, short time horizons, and long political agendas. And no organizational reform ever won a landslide presidential election. As for members of Congress, history has shown legislators are very good at holding hearings when things go awry, not so good at doing much with the findings that they come up with. And who can blame them? The electoral incentives for legislators lead them to focus more on local issues than foreign policy, and more on policy and foreign affairs than the nitty-gritty aspects of organizational design. I research this stuff every day, and even I don't vote for my member of Congress based on his stand on intelligence reform and what he thinks about the CIA's personnel system. Finally, we have national security agency bureaucrats. Here read mostly the Pentagon, who have a huge stake in the design and operation of organizations outside their own. Here I think it's helpful to think about foreign policy as a very different world than domestic policy. In domestic policy, executive branch agencies operate in relatively autonomous spheres of jurisdiction. The EPA doesn't sit around thinking up ways to hobble the Social Security Administration. But in foreign policy, different agencies interconnect in a way that they don't in domestic affairs. We have the use of force, we have diplomacy, intelligence, economics, all have to be a part of the policy-making process. And what that means is that every agency has a dog in the fight of the powers of every other agency in foreign policy. And so what we've seen throughout history is that in particular existing intelligence agencies in the Pentagon and the FBI have resisted efforts to reform the intelligence system because they have a stake in the outcome and they want to protect their autonomy and power. So the upshot of rational self-interest is that presidents are unlikely to tackle thoroughgoing intelligence reform, and when they do, they're unlikely to succeed. In fact, between the CIA's creation 60 years ago last week, 1947, and 9/11, not a single president, Democrat or Republican, has ever championed intelligence reform, despite more than 40 different studies on the subject. That leaves my last enduring reality, which is the structure of American democracy. We know in our system change is supposed to be difficult. The framers intended it that way, hobbling in some ways, or empowering, depending on your perspective, our system to have separation of powers and all sorts of other institutions and rules and mechanisms to prevent the rise of tyranny. The irony here is that some of our most cherished features of our democracy, separation of powers, majority rule, the bicameral Congress, spell bad news from an agency design perspective, because they create a fragmented governmental system that requires compromise to succeed. And what compromise means is that opponents of a new agency have a say in how that agency is created from the get-go. They have the opportunity and the ability to sabotage that agency from its very beginning, and that's exactly what happened with the Central Intelligence Agency. One of the reasons critics have found the director of Central Intelligence for the past 50 years had such weak control over all the intelligence agencies outside the CIA was that his position was crippled back in 1947 deliberately by existing intelligence agencies in the Army and the Navy, the State Department, and the Justice Department. that went and weakened the legislation to empower anything with the name Central in its name. The CIA's creation reminds me of this. There's a wonderful B.B. King lyric, and had I known about it, I would have used it for my last book title, because I think it absolutely captures the dilemma that the CIA faced back in 1947. And the lyric goes like this: "Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too." Now, these same democratic hallmarks mean that reforms down the road are also hard to attain, because legislation, once it's on the books, tends to endure. And so that means that that many of the problems we have in intelligence, some of the toughest problems we have that require legislative fixes, are those least likely to get fixed. Let me end by sharing some thoughts about the future. I'm going to try to be a little bit optimistic, although the book is not, I have to warn you. Ann Richards once famously said, the former governor of Texas, as only Ann Richards can say, "Fools rush in where fools have been before." So let me offer at least some thoughts from looking at history to guide future intelligence reform. I think there are 3 lessons. And the first is that structural reforms are not enough. Our natural reaction, particularly after intelligence failures, is to create new agencies. And while structure matters, culture is equally important to the long-term success of our intelligence agencies. We now have a new alphabet soup of intelligence agencies: the DNI, the NCTC, the FBI's National Security Branch. But these and other new structural arrangements will not actually make us all safer if intelligence officials still view the world through the same old lenses and hoard information in the same old ways. Organizational culture, as I have up here, is a silent but deadly killer of innovation. Let me pose a counterfactual just to bring this a little bit home. Imagine in the first week of January 2000, during that al-Qaeda convention, that we had a director of national intelligence in place. We had this Mike McConnell position back then. Would Khalid al-Mihdhar have gotten into the United States? I believe the answer is still yes, because the failure to watchlist him had much more to do with habits and routines and behavior than with who reported to whom on an organization chart. I think the second implication for reformers is that we need more battle plans and fewer blueprints. I do not have a laundry list of intelligence reforms at the back of my book. I weighed this and went back and forth with various people who read it and my editor for a long time. And I decided that the message that I really wanted to convey was that we've had big new ideas about how to reform intelligence agencies for years. The hard part is getting any of those ideas implemented. Right? So we need to have battle plans for how to actually take advantage of windows of opportunity when they arise to implement intelligence reform, more than we need yet another laundry list of specific fixes to specific agencies. And finally, I'll end with my plea for radicalism, which is that future reformers will have to resist the urge to take the moderate course. If my analysis is right, then the barriers to intelligence reform are enduring. Right? They're systemic and they're difficult to overcome. The nature of organizations, rational self-interest, the fragmented structure of our democracy, these things are not going anywhere anytime soon. And what these enduring realities mean is that the windows for reform are precious, they are few, and they are fleeting. And if reformers want to succeed, they need to be prepared to take advantage of those windows when the next attack comes, and I do believe the next attack is a question of time, so that we make the most of the opportunities that we have. I said I would end on an optimistic note, but I have to share a pessimistic quote from one of the intelligence officials I interviewed. For this project, I interviewed 75 current and former government officials, ranging from senior level officials like FBI Director Bob Mueller to entry-level analysts, special agents, and clandestine case officers. And here's what one former senior intelligence official said to me, and it's at the beginning of my last chapter. "What's needed for the fix is known, but is it accepted? Not generally. And is it well on the way to getting implemented? Not at all. But we have to. There is no other way." And on that very depressing note, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. We'll throw it open to Q&A if you could identify yourself when you ask Jamie a question. Can I start it off with an observation which I'd like you to respond to, which is, it seems to me the problem with al-Qaeda was, imagine if the Japanese High Command in 1937 started going on RKO or NBC declaring their intention to attack the United States. I mean, al-Qaeda made no secret of its intention to attack the United States in interviews with CNN, ABC, and Time Magazine. Is it possible that because the information was open source information that somehow it was sort of devalued? And a kind of corollary of that, it seems to me the problem with these groups in general is that we're deluged with open source information about them. We've got, and, you know, it's almost impossible to keep up. And again, are we devaluing the importance of this open source? I know there's now an open source institute inside the agency. So I just...
That's a great question. I think the answer is probably yes. As you know, in the intelligence world, secrets have a lot more cachet than things found through open sources, even though a great deal of information is found through open sources. It's a very interesting point. I think, and I think it ties in with this Cold War lag that we had. I think in particular, secrets were highly valued against the Soviet enemy. So it was an overlay of the Cold War that impeded, I think, the recognition of the importance of open source information to begin with. But you raised a second problem, which I know is equally important, which is during the Cold War, intelligence officials often talk about the challenge was to get information. After the Cold War ended, the challenge was to sift through the voluminous amounts of information that we have, a fundamentally different challenge that we're still trying to overcome.
Victor Vassar, consultant for national security policy. It's a very insightful analysis. I enjoyed it very much. But let me put this in a broader context. We are now the dominant superpower. If we fail in a particular intelligence, we compensate by allocating more resources. Okay, we screwed up in Iraq. Well, let's allocate more, a couple of $100 billion more, and somehow maybe we'll get through. But 6 years from now, China's GDP will be higher than ours. So as we look into the future, the importance of intelligence rises, because with fewer resources, we have to be very precise how we allocate our resources. Because we will not be able to afford another $100 billion or $200 billion for our stupidity. So that implies that it's not just fixing particular intelligence, but also looking at intelligence in the broader context, allocating more resources to intelligence, and perhaps raising salaries for intelligence. For example, in the Navy, an intelligence specialist can rise only to a 2-star general. Why so? Maybe you should go higher than that. And better access to people. And the multiplicity of other things that are absolutely necessary. So what I'm saying, and please agree or disagree with me, that intelligence in the future will be much more important than it is now. Therefore, we have to be much more precise and reform intelligence all across the board, including salaries of intelligence, access to people, culture, as you said, and multiplicity of other factors.
Well, I agree in parts. I think I agree with most of what you say, and it's a wonderful point about the importance of intelligence in the future. I think today we face a fundamentally different challenge, where we have this paradox where great power doesn't bring security in the way that it did, where we are threatened for the first time since the Treaty of Westphalia by the weak as much as we are by the strong. And given that dramatic shift, I think what that means is that intelligence, more than military capabilities, is both our first and last line of defense. It's far more important in today's world, I would argue, than even it was during the Cold War. So I completely agree with you. Let me add, the China example is a wonderful one. One of the things that I really worry about with intelligence reform is that we're so focused on fixing intelligence to deal with the terrorist threat that we lose what I call the all-around athlete capability to be able to identify the challenges that China may pose, or Russia may pose, or other threats over the horizon. One intelligence official put it very colorfully. He said, by the time we master the al-Qaeda problem, will al-Qaeda be the problem? So I worry that in our effort to fix what's wrong, we may actually hamstring our entire system, making adaptation in the future even harder than it is. Where I might take issue with you is I don't fundamentally believe fixing intelligence requires dramatically more resources. When I look at the major deficiencies in intelligence, poor information sharing, the inability of the FBI to make the cultural transformation to treat analysts as first-class citizens rather than glorified secretaries, the inability of agencies to work as a coordinated team. These are not money issues, principally. They are culture issues, principally. So I worry, for example, in the Director of Operations, which is supposed to, according to the President, increase the number of case officers or spies by 50%, that was the directive in 2004, that we are throwing good money after bad. We don't need more of the same. We need different and better. So I think that a lot of it is more about creativity and culture than it is about resources.
Amy, can I follow up on that observation? Yeah. It seems to me, just anecdotally, that the background check is more onerous than it's ever been in the past. And one thing that, do you have foreign friends? That can be that can be a problem. Have you lived in a foreign country? So I mean, getting to this culture issue, it seems to me that do you have a sense of, are there really people speaking Urdu and Arabic who are being recruited, who really or is that still not happening?
The senior leadership at the CIA says this is a huge priority for them, and they want to make it better. But I have a case of a student of mine that I think just illustrates the problems, exactly what you say. So I have a student who is very smart, Arab American, speaks fluent Arabic, got a Boren Fellowship, so it's a governmental fellowship, to study Arabic in Cairo, where he lived with relatives. And a few years ago, he said he wanted to come back and work at the CIA. So I called some people at the CIA. They said, forget it. He'll never make it through the security clearance process because he has relatives in Cairo. He's been to Cairo. All the things that make him valuable make him a liability from the security clearance process. So he goes to law school, against all my advice, here in Washington. Now he wants to work in the Justice Department. So 2 weeks ago, I get a call, in counterterrorism, I get a call from the person doing his security clearance check. She comes to visit me in my office. She asked me the usual questions. Does he want to overthrow the government? Does he have a gambling problem? And then she gets to foreign travel. And I said, well, we had this National Security Education Program fellowship to Cairo. Scribble, scribble, scribble. And he lived with relatives in Cairo. Scribble, 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 eyes bulging out of her head. Those were raising all sorts of red flags. So we have a long way to go on that. So it's an area that they're aware of, but you can see it has not worked itself out in the bureaucracy.
Go ahead.
Yes, Ned Hodgman, Understanding Government organization, tries to improve the effectiveness of federal government agencies by encouraging journalists to do a better job of covering them. And one of the things that we encounter is the problem of, talk about implementation and blueprints. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about those blueprints, because there's a tension when you try to introduce reform that isn't sexy or interesting for the organization. How are you going to get the leaders of these agencies to focus on nuts and bolts when their organizations and their trajectories as leaders may come into conflict with that?
It's a great question. It's obviously a really hard thing to overcome. I remember when the DNI was created, if you looked at the list of job responsibilities the Director of National Intelligence had, it was create the intelligence budget, brief the president, and then what do you think got put at the bottom of the list? All the personnel stuff. Right? All that really important stuff about promotion incentives and what you reward and how you reward it, which are going to affect the development long-term of the intelligence agencies. And so it's not surprising that these things get short shrift. The short answer I can give you is that those battle plans have to put culture and those kinds of what seem to be unsexy, nuts and bolts kinds of changes have to illustrate how important they are in a meaningful way. So I'm always on the lookout for indicators in the FBI of cultural impediments to change. So I'll give you two that I recently found. At least as late as last year, at new agent training at Quantico with new analysts as well, not only were agents and analysts trained separately, they wore different colored T-shirts, right? So analysts wore beige, agents wore blue. Nothing says different team more loudly than different uniforms, right? That's one class, right? So I think when you make those examples concrete, leaders can become more seized with the urgency of tackling those kinds of touchy-feely symbolic things that are so critical to getting people working together in the same team. The second example I found is if you go to the FBI's website, job postings are listed under two categories: agents, who carry the guns and wear the badges, and everybody else, which means that analysts are relegated to professional support staff alongside auto mechanics and janitors, as they always have. That is still true.
I remember writing about that earlier.
Shockingly, I have written about that, and the FBI still hasn't changed the website, right? So it's still support versus analysts, versus agents. And as one analyst recently told me, Please call us something else. How can we expect special agents to take us seriously as equal partners when we're called support? It doesn't work that way. So I think it has to be personalized, or it has to be dramatized in a way to get leaders in these different agencies to understand the importance of doing these kinds of initiatives right.
Doug?
Yeah, Doug Farrow. I was wondering if you looked at the impact of DHS in the intel game as you were doing this. What role they're playing? Are they mucking it up more, making it more confusing? And how do they interact with other agencies if you looked at that at all?
I looked at it a little bit, but not nearly. I'll stand up so I can see you, but not nearly enough, especially today. So let me emphasize that this book primarily looks backward in time to adaptation failures before 9/11. I have one chapter that looks at what's happened since 9/11, and I talk a little bit about the creation of DHS in that chapter. And what I found was that DHS was in many ways also hobbled from its creation. That intelligence component of DHS was something that was punted on in the original legislation, and then DHS was sabotaged by the creation of the TTIC, which became the National Counterterrorism Center. So just when you create this new agency to do domestic intelligence, the president, by executive order, creates a competing agency to do the exact same thing. So my sense is, and I haven't done enough to write a whole book about this, is that DHS is more recently making some strides in the intelligence front by forward deploying personnel in the regional intelligence center. So there's a point of access from cities like Los Angeles around the country to the federal bureaucracy. Pretty neat idea. But that it's still very unclear who does what in domestic intelligence. What's the FBI doing? What's DHS doing? What are fusion centers supposed to do across the country? So I don't know if you have a particular perspective.
I was just contracting to do some work out of DHS that is essentially replicating work that I know people in DEA are doing, that the CIA have done for 10 years. And I said to the guy who hired me, we've done this every year for 10 years. He said, yeah, but that's what they have the money for. You want to work on it again now? I'm like, well, okay, but we have a pile of reports that no one's read for the last 10 years just sitting there, and we're going to do another one. It will tell us nothing new.
Right.
Sure.
Thank you for the idea of failure to adapt. It's very interesting. I have one more. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a clinical political psychologist, also in conflict studies. I think one other factor in failure to adapt is denial, for one thing. But another thing is that there's a worldview or certain paradigm, which is like going after the symptom rather than the cause, or insisting zero what we call first order change versus second order change, where you say reduce the desire of people to take revenge on us, deal with basic human needs, just grievances, root causes. And I agree with you that another attack is inevitable. It's almost like we're even inviting it or increasing it, but it doesn't have to be inevitable. And it would be possible. It's far, far, far from likely. But I think we're also all in, could adapt to another paradigm. And it's imaginable that we could make certain kinds of changes that would drastically reduce the desire for revenge.
It is, and in fact, I think, but I ultimately come out on the pessimistic side of that equation. Let me try to convince you why I do. The toughest case for my model is what happened since 9/11, right? If ever you would expect there to be a catalyst for major reform, the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history should be it. There's the urgency, the threat is clear, we know what the stakes are. Why haven't we gotten more reform since 9/11? And so then what I found is, and I tracked what happened right after 9/11. Well, right after 9/11, there wasn't a drumbeat for intelligence reform. We got the Patriot Act 6 weeks after 9/11, which was dogs and cats pulled together from previous efforts to enhance law enforcement authorities. Punted on intelligence reform, too difficult to do. We got the Department of Homeland Security, punted on intelligence reform, too difficult to do. So, and only in the summer of 2004, when you had this harmonic convergence of forces, the 9/11 Commission releases its report. George Tenet resigns, right? Staunch defender of the intelligence community. Suddenly there's no public face protecting these agencies from reform. And the Senate, the 9/11 families joined with the 9/11 Commission. So the first ever real domestic interest group pushing intelligence reform, which we'd never had before. They got more TV coverage during the summer of 2004 than the Iraq War. And we also, on top of that, had the Senate Intelligence Committee release its scathing report about Iraq's WMD estimates. So suddenly, for the first time, intelligence reform is a domestic political issue in the midst of a very tight campaign season. So members of Congress have to go to their districts back home and justify their vote for Iraq based on flawed intelligence estimates. So intelligence reform now has a domestic hook. So you have a change in the electoral incentives of members of Congress. And even with all these things, right, the 9/11 Commission, the families, the electoral incentives changing, Tenet resigning, we get a very watered down and ultimately ineffective intelligence reform bill in the fall of 2004. So I look at that, and that tells me that these systemic barriers are incredibly difficult to overcome. I would like to think we can adapt before the next terrorist attack, but given how poorly we've adapted since the last terrorist attack, I'm not that optimistic.
I'm not.
It's possible. I hope I'm wrong.
It's far from, it's very unlikely.
Yes, but it is possible. Yeah.
Jasmine Museum, a contract hearing writer. I was just wondering, as far as culture change is concerned, do you think there might be some issue with still with fear of coming up with new analyses or new ideas that potentially could be wrong, but then maybe in the future turn out to be right, and you don't want to take that chance?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem of risk aversion is something that we all have to deal with in our own professional lives. And, you know, I was struck by something that one intelligence official said to me when we were talking about Iraq and the misestimation of Iraq's WMD capabilities coming on the heels of errors the other way, right? India and Pakistan thought they weren't going to test nuclear weapons in '98 when they did. The first Gulf War, we didn't know Iraq was as far along in its nuclear program as it was. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said the thinking that he felt among analysts was, after 9/11, I'd rather the president lose sleep than lose New York. Better to overestimate a threat than underestimate a threat. It gets to risk aversion in that way, that we tend to overestimate threats rather than underestimate them after catastrophes. But I think it's a huge problem, and it's not one that's easily solved because it involves the interface of the intelligence professional and the policymaker. Right. So one of the areas that I want to look into in the future is how that interface works and how we deal with the psychological pitfalls of decision makers who don't hear information when they get it. How can intelligence products actually influence policymakers when they have strong preconceived notions of what the right policy should be and don't actually take in new information in a way where they're actually thinking about things differently? How can intelligence officials be proactive about addressing those cognitive biases and cognitive traps? But that's something I'm just noodling on right now.
Have you looked at the impact of the mass exodus of the mid-level management of the agencies going out? And are the new people coming in getting trained in any significantly different into a different culture, or are they going to be trained in the culture that already existed, even though they would have a chance in a perfect world to come in and adapt and create a new structure?
Oh, you've identified both a great problem and a great opportunity for intelligence officials. I've looked only a little bit at this in the FBI. And so it's the youngest CIA analytic workforce in the agency's history. So the greening of the workforce means they don't have the experience to make the kind of analytic judgments that experience usually allows you to make. But on the other hand, you have sort of a blank slate to start over and train people differently. And I don't know that there's anything particularly systematic, but it's something I just haven't looked at enough to say one way or the other. It's a great point.
Any other questions?
Everyone's thoroughly depressed.
Well, thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. The quick side,